So as long as my work has been focusing on audience engagement, which started in 2010, I think, I've said that my goal is to work myself out of a job. When you hear social journalism, you probably think first about teams of people distributing content on social media after the rest of the work is done. That's certainly a part of this. But for me, I would rather think of it as a mindset than as a set of tools. I would like journalists to have a set of questions that they ask that keep the work focused squarely on the audience, on the people they aim to serve. I think journalism schools have for a long time done a really good job on focusing on the craft of journalism, on teaching storytelling and gathering information. I'm sad when I see evidence that while we're doing that, we're not also talking about who it aims to serve, who wants it, how those people are going to find it, and whether it actually did the work that we set out to do. The journalism that I have been lucky enough to work in is very mission-driven. We do it because we think information makes communities healthier. We might get nervous when you talk about specific goals in mind, what you want people to do, although I wish we'd be more comfortable with that. But we definitely have a sense that what we're doing matters. So how do we know if it matters if we're not paying attention to where it went after we finished it, and if it's not done with a certain audience in mind? So what I want to do today is talk you through 7 questions that I wish were part of the routine of journalism. We're creatures of habit, right? So like whatever our editor tells us to do, whatever we have been doing for years, we write a budget line. I wish these 7 questions were part of budget lines. If I were teaching reporters, photojournalists, data journalists, graphics, design, all of it. There's room in everyone who commits journalism, I think, should have to answer these questions. So maybe after today, you'll join me in the revolution. So question number 1 is, what does it actually mean to be social? So if you think about that, being social does not mean talking in a lot of places. And that's how journalists typically use social media. We go to a lot of different channels and we keep talking, right? I'm so good at talking on Reddit. I'm so good at talking on Facebook and Twitter, and maybe I even use a different tone of voice when I talk in those different places. Yay me. Being social, if you go to a party and you're social, it doesn't just mean you talk to a lot of people. That makes you annoying. If you go to a party and you're social, it means you're also listening. And not just listening, because if you just include talking and listening, that's like taking turns talking. That's not social. When you listen, you also have to adjust what you're doing based on what you're hearing back. So social journalism takes into account its feedback. Social journalism pays attention to the responses to the messages and does better next time or repeats what's working. So if you go to a party with a specific anecdote in mind and you tell it to one group and they're like charmed out of their minds by it, you tell that anecdote again, you file it away. Oh, that was funny. So what are we doing as journalists to be social, not just master a bunch of platforms and what it means to talk there? Question number 2, where do ideas come from? I wish I had a CMS that had a field for this. I want to track it. I want to see in newsrooms, how do we decide to do this? And I think we'd probably be horrified by how often it was that like an editor drove by something and thought it was interesting and assigned it a story, right? Like my friends were talking about this, my neighbors were talking about this, and then we wonder why we don't express the diversity of the community. So a lot of times journalists could tell you what they think is interesting, but are we listening in the right places? Are we teaching our students to listen in person? Are we investing in that? Are we teaching students about social listening and what that means and all the ways there are to eavesdrop? Are we asking? Do you know how hard it is to find some journalists? Like to track them down and email or call them? Are we accessible as journalists? And I've had members of my community outreach team like ride around a park on rollerblades asking people what's interesting to them. Are we actually going into the community and saying, what's important to you? And putting those on our idea list. Next question, when does the story begin and end? Most journalists could tell you when a story begins for them, but are they doing the work of figuring out when the story began for the community, or when the story began for the people you're covering? And when a story ends, man, like when a story ends for a journalist is usually when they turn it into their editor, or when it goes live on air, in print, online, whatever. But for everyone except journalists and their sources, that's when the story begins. So are we paying attention and respecting the life cycle of a story that begins long before us and is really just getting going as we brush off our hands and move on to the next assignment? Where are the opportunities to stay involved in the conversation? Next question, who can help tell the story? Who knows more about this than we do? Most everybody. When a journalist begins a story, there's so many people who know way more about it than we do. Gosh, when I think back to my early stories I did for an alt weekly and how little I knew about pulp mining in Alaska and those first few sources before the internet who got the phone call from me saying, can you tell me what this is? Your sources certainly know more about it than you do, but often the community knows more about something than you do. Why don't we as journalists say, here's what we're working on next. Do you want to weigh in? As a beat reporter, why doesn't every story end with a, here's what's up next on my agenda? Whose voices are you inviting and how? Are you inviting people to contribute in ways that feels natural to them? Or are you putting in your product a phone number to call the newsroom and calling it good? Are you going where the people who most care about something are and asking them to help tell the story? Asking, what do people usually get wrong about this? What are the pitfalls? What questions should I ask? Who should I not talk to? And who should I absolutely be sure to talk to? Who is the journalism for? So I know more people these days are talking about audience segmentation, and I just want to say a bit about this. When I think about who the journalism is for, I usually picture a funnel. And for those of you whose work primarily is geographic media, I've worked mostly in local journalism, and so all the people of mid-Missouri, that's your audience, right? So when you look at the funnel, who's this journalism for? It's everybody. Well, really the world should care about what I just produced. But at least everyone in this geographic area has the potential to care about this and should see it. It's perfectly fine if that's your goal. But the real fun starts when you're willing to get more specific. I hope parents will see this. I hope parents at this specific school will see this. I hope people who ride the bus will see this. I hope people who ride this specific bus route will see this. Who's going to be entertained by it? Who are the stakeholders? Who really needs it? And are we teaching a kind of journalism that is done with those people in mind? What mood will they be in when they're likely to want to consume it? Which leads to the next question. How should the journalism reach those people? Once you start to think about parents at a specific school as being the audience for something, it changes your distribution strategy. Most journalists would not say that distribution is part of their job. They would say they hand it off to a team of people who produces the news and makes sure it gets to the audience. But the more audiences are fragmented, the less likely it is that any one person's going to see it. So you get back to that question of, why are we here? Why are we doing this? And if the parents at this specific school have no idea that we're covering them, what good did it do? Okay, maybe all taxpayers were invited to see it. But why aren't we, with every piece of journalism, coming up with a distribution strategy? Maybe not every, because not every little 300-word story merits this kind of response. But when it matters, where online are people talking about this? Who should we tag? What subreddit is the right opportunity for this? What email listserv does somebody have access to? What physical location is the right place to reach the people who most need this information? The photocopier is a really, really popular tool of my community engagement team because very often running copies of something and taking it to a meeting is the best way. Very sophisticated, fancy tool to reach the right audience. So why doesn't everyone going to cover a city council meeting go with a stack of something that invites interaction, says here's what we have coming up next, says here's some background reporting on these issues that are being discussed? How hard is that really, to make a one sheet that says here's what's on the agenda and some short links and context so that when people are sitting in a meeting, they're invited to get smarter. And we see people actually doing that, like sitting in meetings, reading up on something, getting smarter as they wait for their turn to talk. Maybe it's parents at a specific school and you get permission to stand and hand it to them. We've actually sold ads on the back of paper handouts when we realized there are other people who would pay for the privilege of reaching the audience that we have a product designed to reach. It was the audience at a high school football game. And as it turns out, someone would give us money to put an ad on the back of a handout at a high school football game. So if you say the people at all alumni of this high school should benefit from this information, don't stop there. Say, how do we reach them online? In what places do they talk? What email lists do they all get? What's the best way to connect with them? And where will they all be in person? How about that at the football game? Last question, how will we know if the journalism worked? We have a whole panel tomorrow on metrics and impact. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. But journalists in general are really bad about saying what they hope will happen. They want all of it. They want more new visitors, more returning visitors, longer time spent, more views, more pages per visit, all of it. More traffic from search, more traffic from social, more direct traffic. So maybe it's like Brian was saying at NPR, how many people who hit the begin button got to the end. Maybe you're trying to drive conversation. Do you know how many journalists I've heard complain that there weren't any comments on their story? Sometimes they complain that there are comments on their story. But a lot of times when you ask journalists what they hope will happen, they'll say, I want to drive conversation. I want to spark conversation. And then they'll watch, and there are no comments. Well, did we invite conversation really? Did we pose any questions? Did we jump in and ask any questions? Did we say where the issue's going next? Did we spin it forward at all? Or did we just put it out there and hope people talked? And if you're looking for conversation, how are you going to measure that? Is it number of comments? Is it number of unique commenters? Is it number of replies so that you can track actual threads of conversation? What percentage of the comments are responding to somebody else rather than just firing off a one-off comment? What is it you hope will happen? Sometimes there's data, analytics, comments, numbers that you can track. Sometimes it's quality. Sometimes what I hope will happen is that that a piece of journalism will invite feedback that will help us do better journalism. Totally qualitative. But are we set up to pay attention, invite, and receive people who say, what you need to do next is this? Or who you really need to talk to, who flies under the radar but knows more about this than anyone else? Check with this person here. That's a total win. So maybe one phone call to the newsroom saying, here's who you've really got to talk to so that you cover this authentically. That's a total win. So for me, social journalism is about a relentless focus on the people we aim to serve. It's about listening, talking, and adjusting what we're doing based on what we hear. And that's from the agenda setting phase, how are we deciding what to cover, all the way through to after the community, the public, is invited to see something. Are we there? Are we still a part of the conversation? Are we paying attention? That's what it looks like to be social. I think that newsrooms desperately need people who think this way. They desperately need people who pay attention to what happens after they hit publish, who can say, this was a really great story. Here's what I learned about reporting. Here's how I know that it served the audience. When I talk to editors who get cover letters that have that information, here's my best story, and I was so happy to see people spent 6 minutes average with the story. Editors and publishers get so excited that they even know how to think that way. It's starting to feel irresponsible to me to train more journalists who are really good at the craft of journalism, but don't have baked in a focus on the audience and a sense of what it means to do journalism socially. None of this is about fancy tools. It's not about having engagement units in your class or classes dedicated to audience engagement. It's about baking into all journalism a philosophy that is social. I put up on my blog today a bunch of links of places where I've listed described case studies, including the time we actually made money from a handout, in case you want to see, and we'll talk more about it at tomorrow's impact measurement, engagement, and analytics session. Thank you.